non-budgetary. So Thank you, Mr. Chair. Somebody got their laptop on the Zoom. I don't connected. Could you mute that one, please? Thank you. So to speak, this one.
Can you check because it looks music?
Let me know. Are you muted?
It looks music.
Is it someone now?
Right?
No. You just mute that all together. Oh, it is.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Mic. There is a mic as well there.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Lydia.
No, the other one. The Zoom workspace. Oh, don't close it. Open it. Make it bigger.
Maybe somebody has his on. And it's new.
It says it sounds like I think it's in sound because sound sounds not.
And now, no.
Voices. No, it goes the voices. Because something must happen. Then you go to 0.
You did? No. Shouldn't you go on Zoom and mute? Yeah, there, the first. No,
Yeah.
no, it's like this.
I think so. I've put on.
Okay, that's one of my bad idea.
Very good point.
I have a bad. But know your limits.
I'll just turn off the. There'll be no sound.
You all should leave the meeting.
Yeah.
There's some. There's fine before, right? It's fine. I don't know. Leave the meeting and rejoin. Maybe leave and rejoin. Yeah.
Leave and rejoin.
No, ma io facciamo scelte politiche.
We can critique.
Ah, vabbè, sono giustificato però.
Yeah, but they want to record, I think, no? They were recording.
Okay.
I think if we just start the call again.
Sorry, James, impact.
Italiano in
Welcome to my world, and I'm trying to use the rules.
Which I have the code.
This RSM and RSM is.
Very rarely, but very rarely hybrid lectures. Normally the classes are only in situ.
I think it just doesn't need to be on. Or does it for sharing?
It's for sharing screen sharing or how?
We do it yesterday.
And maybe
Yeah, we did.
maybe you can log in and then turn the sound off.
Yes.
And so with
Yes.
Oh, please.
Recording in progress. No, we have an AI assistant. I think.
I'm perfectly happy with her, so I don't know, I'm.
Just missing the HR part, but.
And I question my human touch. I think she's real anyway.
Because that you think.
Avatar.
Very perfect to be real, maybe she's a new.
Avatar.
That's right, morning.
Okay.
Perfectly, and then was being shared, or?
Okay, yeah, I mean, there is presentation, yours, I
Oh,
know.
no.
But there will be this afternoon again.
Yeah, that's fine. But then this is fine? Yes,
Yeah.
for now, it's okay.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
let's talk about digitalization, industrial policy.
Yeah, thank you so much. So my story on industrial policy links nicely to the story on defense policy, which in turn really nicely links to the discussion I had with Stéphane last time on public procurement in the defense sector. So I'm sure you'll have some questions for Federico on possible solutions, even without having a European defense community. So that was really interesting. So on industrial policy, I heard that President von der Leyen said a few weeks ago in her State of the Union address that Europe should have its own small, affordable electric cars. And she even gave it a branding exercise on the spot. The E for environmental, the E for economical, and the E for European. EEE car. EEE car. And that line stayed with me, not because I'm shopping for a new car, but because it perfectly crystallizes the question of my presentation. How does industrial policy drive inclusive prosperity? And when does it risk obstructing it? Because what she described was not just industrial target, but a social promise that Europe can deliver climate-friendly technology that ordinary people can actually afford. And an industrial policy that only produces luxury car for the wealthy is necessarily inclusive. And an industrial policy that produces an affordable European electric car for families and workers, accessible also for SMEs, and integrated into our own European supply chains. That comes probably much closer to what von der Leyen was meaning. But of course, when I hear the third E, the European, my mind wanders not necessarily to glossy cars, but to the treaty, Article 173 of the TFU on industry. It's quite an infamous policy clause that tells us that industrial policy may support, coordinate, and supplement, but must not distort, must not harmonize, must not overstep. And for decades, Article 173 was basically the quiet cousin at the competence dinner table. And if you read today's legislation on industrial policy, it very often uses other legal bases than Article 173, or it uses a co-basis. But of course, the idea, despite the very sort of weak supporting legal basis, industrial policy has really been back into the driver's seat. And that basically raises the question, can a political label carry promises that go far beyond the legal focus that actually underpins these political promises? And that's the frame I want to share with you today. Because we are, as you could say, we are in the midst of what you could call a constitutionalization of industrial policy. For many years, the Commission stayed true to Article 173. It was focused on keeping markets open, helping SMEs, lead structural change, foster cooperation to make sure that the competitiveness of European industry would exist. Well, I heard there's a whole new Jean Monnet Center on the word competitiveness. It's just like prosperity. Competitiveness.
We will invite you.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
The question is it competitiveness of a single undertaking? Is the competitiveness of an industry? Is the competitiveness of a country? Is the competitiveness of the European Union? Are the same or the NATO? And is having a competitive industry always in the union's interest? Also depends on what kind of. And then of course there are. I'm not an economist, but I've got lots of economic literature on the notion of competitiveness. It's quite an unclear notion as well. So it's really interesting. But today you see that politics, and particularly EU politics, demands distributive outcomes. So affordable cars, green jobs, regional balance, strategic autonomy, defense readiness. So the rhetoric shift has really shifted from enabling prosperity to promising it. But the law, the actual competences haven't really changed all that much. Don't get me wrong, I'm not here to basically mourn the return from industrial policy. It's actually quite, it's puzzling. I mean, it has really given Brussels a new toy box. I can mention a few things: the CHIPS Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act, the Net Zero Industry Act, grid reform, battery regulation, hydrogen alliances, project of common European interest, single market emergency instruments, and now most dramatically defense and space initiatives. Sorry?
The EDIRPA, European Defense Industrial Enforcement,
Yeah.
ASAP also is.
Yeah. And what fascinates me is basically how quickly the logic has flipped. So industrial policy used to be the art of making space, so lowering transaction costs, reducing barriers, building conditions to be able for industry to become competitive. And now it's the art of making promises. We will have X% of chips produced in Europe. We will build Y gigafactories for battery production. We will guarantee quality jobs. We will have a just transition in every region. And of course, all excellent aspirations. But legally, it's almost like writing performance targets into the preamble of a screwdriver manual, basically. That's what it is. You can try, but that's how to tighten the screws. And let me give an example. For example, in state aid. So the Commission has expanded frameworks for green and digital transition. And the main operational measure so far has been an update of the rules governing state aid via the so-called Clean Industry State Aid Framework. And these rules aim to simplify and broaden what national governments can fund, including support for energy costs in energy-intensive industries, industrial decarbonization, and clean tech manufacture. But of course, the beneficiaries here, and you can already see that, you also see that in the defense sector, and you also refer to it at the divide between Scandinavia and other regions. The beneficiaries are almost always those member states with deep fiscal pockets. And those firms are already at the frontier. So inclusion is promised, but asymmetry is actually delivered by these really nice initiatives. And of course, a treaty don't necessarily forbid this outcome. But I think they never intended industrial policy to become a race in subsidy capacity. So the very logic of open and competitive markets underpinning Article 173 is at stake here. Or take corporations. We have alliances on hydrogen, on microelectronics, on raw materials. Of course, cooperation is good. It spreads risks and first mover disadvantages. It accelerates knowledge sharing. But when alliances become exclusive clubs or important projects of European interest are extended indefinitely, what was meant as diffusion becomes concentration. And again, that's problematic for the inclusive part of inclusive prosperity. And then there's another dimension to the story, the turn inward. So alongside these beautiful alliances and subsidies, Europe has equipped itself with quite a few defensive instruments. For example, foreign investment screening, first started in a few countries. For example, France was famous for it, and now it's almost everywhere. The foreign subsidies regulation, I was just recently involved in the first European dawn raid, which actually took place here in Rotterdam. A Chinese company called Nuctech produced safety apparatus in airports. If you go through security in any European airport, it's being produced by a Chinese company called Nuctech, and the question was that European companies were unable to compete for the European market because they were subsidized partly indirectly by the Chinese Communist Party. And of course, you have anti-coercion measures, and each, of course, they respond to real vulnerabilities, and basically also the weaponization of trade dependencies. But of course, the question is also, this is really undermining sort of the European project. Competence for national security is quite limited at the EU level, so that's why the member states have to the European Commission started as much as it can to make sure that all the systems are at least quite similar in nature. But I know from practice that, for example, the system in Denmark is completely different from the German system. It's completely different from the French system. So it's actually also horrible from an investment perspective. It's a paradise for lawyers, but from an economic perspective, it's and also from a European perspective, it's really bad actually. This is sort of the structural paradox, I would say. So the more we stretch industrial policy to deliver distributive justice, the more we risk entrenching insiders and widening divides. And the irony is that the treaties are very clear on what industrial policy is for. They never promised it would be distributive. They promised it would be enabling. So instead of dwelling on error messages, I see it differently. I say that industrial policy in Europe has always been a framework of conditions, a sort of scaffolding that makes innovation, inclusion, and resilience possible. But what has changed is the weight that we place on that scaffolding. So it now carries the attribute of semiconductor government and drone effect. And this is a heavy load, but probably not an impossible one. But the treaties give us more flexibility than we sometimes admit. Precisely because industrial policy can be built on different legal bases, on internal market, on environment, on research cohesion, etc., etc. So this means that we should focus on the kind of enabling measures that really do translate into inclusive outcomes. But we should also be honest about what the law cannot guarantee. So industrial policy cannot legislate away global shocks. It cannot promise distribution where competence is borrowed, for example, from the internal markets. And here we come to a deeper governance problem, is that the level of government that used to hold many of the former industrial policy tools, national governments, they have been severely restrained by EU discipline of state aid and, of course, the internal market. We all know that. But the level that's now expected to deliver prosperity, namely the European Union, has not been given full competence in return. So basically, I would say there's a kind of governance gap in the area of industrial policy. So the national powers have been clipped, but EU powers remain partial and independent. So industrial policy has become a shared project, but not without a very clear center of gravity. And this makes inclusion very fragile, because the scaffolding is there, but the capacity to guarantee distributive outcomes is neither fully national nor fully European. So what we're left with is a framework that can support conditions, but not command results. And then there is the additional twist, and here I link to Federica. Of course, since 2020, industrial policy has also been increasingly yoked to defense. And I'll refer to what Federica said about this, but of course, inclusiveness here is particularly fragile in the defense sector, because defense markets are quite concentrated. There is an exclusion in Article 346, an exclusion for national security matters, which basically means that procurement is also quite opaque in the defense sector, and that derogations in competition rules are comparatively easy to justify. So this is an additional issue when it comes to inclusive prosperity in the defense sector. So I think I'm running out of time. So let me circle back to that small, affordable European car. That's a wonderful image, environmental, economical European. But let's imagine that we only build a sleek prototype, but without the charging stations, without the supply chains, without the financing that makes it accessible. And that is not inclusive prosperity. That is aspiration without access. Thank you.
We'll continue with 54 comments. Then we immediately turn to the audience.
Yeah.
So you can already prepare questions if you want.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank all the panelists for the papers they submitted to me. Very interesting research already sort of advanced our research agenda, different elements that we can comment on. It's a lot on the table with different details, so I will try to limit myself to full comments / questions in each presentation. But before doing that, perhaps I have a more transversal comment, considering the theme of the conference, considering what we discussed yesterday and what we will continue discussing as part of PROSPER. So if we really take the assumption, I mean, the sort of preliminary objective of inclusive prosperity as an end itself, and trying to really observe how it does play out with over higher policy objectives, namely those 4 S that we've been discussing: stability, sustainability, security, and solidarity. So I will try to sort of link to that in each comment and questions, and also perhaps ask for more reflections or thoughts on any trade-offs or indeed incompatibility we may observe. So Federico, first of all, you also shared with me a very advanced working paper. I mean, it's already published, as you said. So I have perhaps 2 elements that are more connected with the papers than the presentation. The first comment and question that I have to you relates to the claim that the current priority that we observe in new policymaking, but also lawmaking for defense, that you really outlined perfectly today, really triggered a paradigm shift away from stability in the functioning of EMU. And as you know, I'm working also in EMU, so here I would try to push you a little bit and to see if instead of an alternative, when you say push away from stability, it means it sort of look like they really get rid of all of it. So there is the fiscal aspect dimension, fiscal governance, but I would argue that for financial stability, price stability, we have other frameworks that are really embedded and are still there. So instead of an alternative, perhaps a cumulative, and then also to say that some of the policy frameworks, legal frameworks that you presented, despite their shortcomings and perhaps, you know, sort of contribution to the current state, that they can equally preserve a degree of stability. This from the in EMU, the financial aspects and monetary aspects, if we sort of depart from economic and fiscal governance. So here, trying to reflect upon the compatibility of security with stability, and perhaps bringing here this notion of sustainability for public finances. So here, of course, you refer to the national level, what we sort of suspended for a while, etc. So perhaps the public sustainability of public finance. That was the first comment. Then the second comment here, something that could be explored further in the context of this paper, or perhaps an extension of the article, is the dimension of solidarity. Because as you said, there is this legal basis of Article 122 that is sort of, as you said in the presentation, you consider that it's shaky, but still there is this reference to the spirit of solidarity between member states. And perhaps this is also something that can be further developed in this sort of approach to how we ensure this higher policy level objective of sustainability, security, and we're putting them together with solidarity in that respect. And of course, here jumping, because I cannot give credit to everything that you presented, but jumping to the prospects when you say, well, we should go for a common defense funding at EU level, etc., that we bring in with a risk sharing dimension that is very difficult to achieve in the EU context. So here, perhaps I would ask you to develop a little bit in terms of political feasibility, if you have time in your answers to the comments and questions. So I think that's it. That leads me to the three comments / questions I promised. I will go on to Lina. So thanks very much. Very extensive mapping indeed of the drivers and obstacles with a very rich research agenda. I think we could elaborate different elements within that paper. And here perhaps really starting from the point of socially inclusive prosperity. I don't know if it's something that we could like be adaptive if we are speaking about this policy area in EU, and if there is this interesting value, because indeed you underline that there is a shared normative commitment, so somehow it's very much principle based. And I was wondering if in our approach to inclusive prosperity, when we look at a specific field, indeed if we can think about this intrinsic value of socially inclusive prosperity, and where, due to some demands of social justice, solidarity, depending on the policy field, indeed, we will shift also during the balance in the spectrum, we will shift more towards that dimension. So, and then the second question, so to perhaps to ask you to elaborate a little bit on the argument of using inclusiveness next to solidarity and fairness as European public good. This is something you put in the paper and you presented. And perhaps to discuss a little bit more what could be indeed the tensions and obstacles as you did to deliver on those European public goods of solidarity, inclusiveness, and fairness. And lastly, I was very interested, so in the second part of the paper, when you investigate the different obstacles, and in particular the political polarization and skepticism, and the fact that there should be a role of redistributive measures and solidarity mechanism. Here, if we can start perhaps elaborating on those redistributive measures and solidarity mechanism, considering the limited EU competence. So sort of trying to go one step ahead and say, when we want to deliver on this socially inclusive prosperity, and we want to work on those mechanisms and redistributive measures, what could we do beyond what is observed now? I know it's a very difficult question. Perhaps it's an extension of the paper. It was beyond the drivers and obstacles, but I was very much interested and sort of, talking about the social transition that has been never really mentioned. I mean, at some point we are all about green and digital transition, but the social aspect was really left more on the sort of in the closet. So that's it. And last but not least, for Phil, so regarding industrial policy, thanks very much for your presentation and also the policy brief that you shared, and asking you develop a little bit more on the tensions between indeed the prosperity in the context of industrial policy that would be subordinated to security. So this is working also indeed with the paper of Federico. Is there a way to ensure profitability and sort of, you mentioned security demands may displace inclusiveness, so sort of to elaborate on that dimension. And so here, this is really between, if we base ourselves really before as we are in tension between the inclusive prosperity we want to achieve with the objective of stability. The other aspect that was surprising to me and sometimes a little bit commented, under explored is the organizing competitiveness project. So here is the tension with Petit as well. And somehow, so you said it very clearly in your presentation, the fact that, well, we have a living constitution, we interpret, we go, legally speaking, it is problematic. In political terms, we need to act, so there is a necessity somehow. But from the inclusive perspective, what I got from the paper, the policy paper, is that it's clearly insufficient and under-delivering for inclusiveness, the inclusive aspect. But there is still a policy making room for maneuver that is imperfect that we can discuss. So you mentioned the inclusive outcomes that we should expect. So if you can unpack this a little bit. And last but not least, the third question I would have here or comment is to sort of look at, in the context in which legally we are stretching our legal basis. Somehow we are under-delivering, and there are many aspects that are in tension, but what are the consequences for our economy, society, people, but then also the retroaction. And here I'm going to put in the discussion the big word of accountability mechanism. So what is the retroaction that we may find? And for industrial waste, it's very, this is something I've been working on as well. So this is from me. I know this is lots of questions. This is just to be picked in. To continue discussing during the break, because I'm pretty sure that many of our colleagues will have other questions. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a brief idea already. Who has questions? Okay, then I think we kind of move in this direction. Fabian first.
Thank you very much for these very interesting presentations and for keeping to the brief, of course, with one exception, Federico. Huh? So, so the question of what are then the drivers, and then what are the obstacles, and what then is the role when it comes to inclusive prosperity of defense, or is that simply far-fetched to somehow see defense as part of inclusive prosperity? The reasons for defense spending being below 2%, of course, you also know that's not only because of the Stability and Growth Pact and the rules that only those that wanted to care about really cared about. But the main reasons in countries like Germany rather being that there was nothing to be gained politically by having 2% of GDP spent on military in the past. So I think that's a little bit too much credit to the very lax fiscal rules we have in place, that they somehow kept countries from spending. Common defense spending is NGO style financing. My question, really the one and most sensible way of doing things. So I think it's clear that we need to revisit the own resources. And it goes back to a point I made yesterday. Where do these additional own resources need to come from? And is then borrowing the first thing that we should think about? Lina, I was wondering how, because I'm not sure you mentioned Article 3.3 on TU, referring to highly competitive social market economy. Where do you see us these days with regard to that? And Kim, also very interesting. You know, the governance gap you referred to, of course, remind me immediately of the classic internal market course we do, where we talk about the gap between negative and positive integration, right? So yes, the EU has no competence for health, but make no mistake, that doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want to when it comes to health policy, because if it's a barrier to free movement and you can't justify it, there you go.
Yeah.
And then, and so there has been a critique for a long time. Of course, maybe the idea of the drafters of the treaty was that would somehow put sufficient pressure then on countries to decide, okay, let's join, let's harmonize, but that logic probably is not working here. So maybe a more serious question is, do we need a denationalization of industrial policy altogether? With it then the creation of let's say true European industrial champions. So I was just scrolling this morning through the Financial Times, which has an article on Can Paris and Berlin rescue the joint fighter jet project? The FCAS, Future Combat Air System, where there is this ongoing infight between France and Germany, mainly, both of which basically want to ensure that their own industrial base is, you know, and of course, to some extent, that, I mean, if that is kind of like the level at which this continues, you know, I don't really see how we will move to any kind of
Except EDC. Except EDC.
Yeah, so yeah, and I have quite a few questions about that, because I wonder whether that is not really a totally dodgy proposal. But we'll do that some other time. Thank you.
I think we have time for 2 rounds. So I would ask Stéphane.
Yes.
To ask question, then I give it to you and you can select already 2 or 3 you would like to answer.
Well, merci beaucoup. Many thanks for your very stimulating presentation. Just a couple of remarks, or maybe some precision. On defense, we spoke a very little bit last evening on that, but I think we must focus also on this rule of purchasing and the rule of public procurement. We have a directive on public procurement of defense, which had been adopted in 2009. We have a new proposal on defense procurement last June. And inside this proposal, there are maybe some shifts for instance, in the issue of central purchasing body, central purchasing body between several member states, or what we call joint public procurement, marché public conjoint, joint public procurement between several member states. I don't know whether this proposal will lead to success, but this is interesting in terms of articulation with sovereignty. How member states are okay or not to leave part of their sovereignty in order to have joint purchases of equipment of defense. And in this issue of public procurement, because purchasing military equipment are public procurement. In this issue of public procurement, we have also basically an issue of European preference. Do we need, or do we want or not to put inside this new directive clauses of preference? We have such preferences, for instance, in some technical text, for instance, for infrastructure. Do we want to oblige the contracting authority in terms of defense to buy more than 50% of equipment which are from EU? But that's why this is another question. How to determine the origin? How to be sure that the chain of production before is really truly European, also including subcontracting and subcontracting chain of economic operator. And that, in my view, a very important point. For social policy,
How did the US do that?
Huh?
Because the US has a binational clause for the defense procurement.
yes.
how do they do that with subcontractors?
Well, they oblige the main contractor to justify a very strict control of its own contractor, and there is a form of droit de regard of control from the main contracting authority on the chain of contractor, and the subcontractor, they have to be paid by the contracting authority. So this direct link of payments creates obviously a link of control.
Yeah.
That's maybe one of the key points. On the social issue, that was very interesting. I was also thinking about the big reluctancy we have between member states on that. Look, for instance, at these cases on the directive of minimum wages. I don't know yet the final ruling has been delivered or not. I think we're waiting. We have this conclusion of Advocate General last January. We have this directive on minimum wages. We have a group of member states led by Denmark, which is against this directive on minimum wages. And behind the technical debate on the right or proper legal base, is it the right or bad legal base? But this is more a pretext. I mean, the main problem is a political division on the deep meaning of social policy. C'est l'application forêt. So we need to maybe to take into point, because yet for now 2 or 3, maybe for now 5 or 6 years, we are maybe in a new start for social policy. That's true. Social pillar and so on, but notwithstanding with new elements, we still have a strong reluctancy on this harmonization.
Already very excellent comments, so I give the floor to you for about 2 minutes each to really select what you want to respond to. That allows us also for the others then to ask questions, and then you have the final word where you can put everything on the table. Federico, then, same order.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Christy, for the comments and for all the questions. I'll try to answer them in 3 points, trying to collect multiple inputs. So the first one is on the relationship between stability, security, and solidarity. The second on defense funding, borrowing and taxation, and the third one on procurement and industrial policy. So on the first point, which I'm trying to bring together both your comments, Christy, I think what we are seeing is a shift from a paradigm of fiscal stability to a new world where international security matters. I think the original design of EMU is really for sunny days, and all of a sudden we're realizing that there is the jungle out there, and then international security matters, and that defense spending is something that has to be factored in the functioning of economic and monetary union. Fabian shakes his head, but I think that's absolutely the case. And I mean, it's no surprise that EMU was created after the end of history, to cite Fukuyama. I mean, it's really the peace dividend, the end of the Cold War, the idea that we are a Europe whole and free without major challenges. The Americans are taking care of our security. That is gone. Now, I think I was citing Laszlo for that, because it seems to me we are still in a transition. We haven't fully abandoned the stability paradigm, but certainly fiscal stability has been tempered in light of international security concern. There is an awareness now at EU level that, yes, spending for defense is important. And if that means going over the 3% deficit, it's okay. That's, I think something new. What I still don't see very much, that was the third prong of the triangle, is this European solidarity element. The spending for security is mostly national, but we are missing really the mechanism of burden sharing that we have had in other structures, like in the NGU after COVID. So it is still a transition, but definitely I think fiscal stability is being, we can discuss on the right word, but I think it's being definitely diluted in view of the need for Europe to take care of international security to a greater extent. Now, that takes me to the point that, the second point where Fabian asked me the question, and Fabian, I have to be hard on you, because I don't think it's only politics that explains the German position on defense spending. it's just as I said yesterday, it's the business model that Merkel had: cheap energy from Russia, security from the US, export from China. It worked well, but it created dependencies, and I think.
Yeah, but it has nothing to do with some sort of, we have to make sure that we don't breach the Stability and Growth Pact.
Sure.
I don't.
But there was no concern that, so to say, defense is expensive. That's I think something that has to be said. I mean, the idea that defense came for free was very much, I think, a shared feeling in the political.
Yeah, which is a different point, but that we are on the same page.
Exactly. So there, it seems to me, I mean, the Zeitenwende is not Schulz in 2022. The Zeitenwende is Merz now that says we need whatever it takes for defense, and that's it connects to the prior point, but it is a big shift in the political perception of the situation. On the point of how you fund defense, I mean, the historical evidence is that defense is always funded through borrowing, not through taxation. And in fact, it's actually interesting empirically that countries that have had large armies never had balanced budget obligation. The US is the perfect example. You have balanced budget obligation at the state level, but the federal government has always been able to issue tons of debt, and partly because it has had the largest standing army in the last century. So it will be inevitable, in my view, that if we want to move in the direction of a European defense, it will have to be funded through borrowing. And the example of the EDC is interesting here, because actually the EDC treaty gave to the community the ability to issue bonds to finance a common army, and it's no surprise that this is it. Okay, maybe we talk more about the EDC in the next round, but just to finish up on procurement and industrial policy, I was very pleased, Pim, also their presentation. I think Stéphane question also comes into this. My reading of where we are going is pretty negative. I think the efforts to overcome fragmentation in procurement have spectacularly failed. All the measures that were put in place since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and now with Trump, they claim they want to overcome fragmentation in public procurement in defense. The reality is they don't do it. The SAFE regulation, the Security Action for Europe, the Commission proposal said the loans can only be used for joint procurement. As the regulation moved through the Council, an exception was introduced. So during year one until May 2026, countries can spend the billions on their own. And of course, all the 150 billions will be spent by May next year. So basically, this is not about joint procurement or overcoming the fragmentation. It's just funding fragmented national defense. And Pim, I thought your presentation was excellent. And as you said, there's so many connections with mine. In industrial policy, the strategy, again, is not common funding of industrial programs like you would do in the US, is go ahead with state aid. Do what you want if you have the money. No. But that is not a common industrial policy, simply saying, okay, I just raised the white flag, and those who have this fiscal space to spend more will do it. Actually, in Paris, the next PROSPER conference, we will also come back to this. I'm going to present another paper where we look at the numbers of state aid and the new state aid framework. I mean, it's the three largest member states that spend basically 90% of the funding. This is not an industrial policy to me, or at least it's not an EU industrial policy. It's just a EU national base, and for defense procurement is the same. So I don't want to repeat myself, but there again, the EDC provided a very interesting model because they understood that you won't get there by simple market incentive. There has to be a strong steering. And as we did for the coal and steel community, where there was a high authority which had control on production of coal and steel, the defense community gave the same powers to the community institutions of basically a monopoly over the defense procurement. And we can discuss whether that's desirable or not, but I think if this is the goal, there's no other way to get there.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Christy, very difficult questions. We will need to have another 1 month on these questions. I've been wondering, because you suggested to use the term socially inclusive prosperity. I'm wondering what else could inclusive prosperity be instead of socially, like environmentally or economically? I'm really not sure. I think when we say inclusive, we mean socially inclusive. I don't know if can it be something else and not socially. I think these two terms are.
Be whatever you want it to be.
Yeah, I think, yes, like including animals and trees, or I don't know, I don't know,
Pets.
cats and dogs, rivers and forests.
No, well, I mean, here my thinking was more, we're looking at prosperity in the Prosper Network, and then we, in that framework of that conference, we said inclusive prosperity.
Yes.
To stress that we go beyond the economics, the
Yes.
indicators, the measures,
Yes.
etc.
Yeah.
But then the inclusiveness can be for people, can be for industry, for specific sectors. So here we would go into the industrial policy, can be for stakeholders, local social partners, inclusiveness for, I mean, to some extent, I don't know, that's another question I could not throw in the panel yet, but the horizontal consistency across EU policy areas. I mean, to me, there might be a specific approach to inclusive depending on the field. So when I raised that question was a little bit, would there be something specific about EU social policy? And to me, indeed, inclusive, I think first and foremost about social, socio-economic, and I fully agree with you, but perhaps if we go in internal market policies, or if we try to look at another area, it's a question mark.
Economically inclusive prosperity. I mean, prosperity has the economic element in it, I think. And then if we add inclusive, I understand is that we add the social element. So I think to say economically inclusive prosperity, you have the economic element in the prosperity and the social element in the inclusive.
But I
This
think
is how, but it's totally.
I think inclusive is a more encompassing term to me, how I approach it.
Think of that, but it doesn't sound very convincing to me when I
I
first.
mean, in the literature, definitely, it's not limited to social aspects at all.
Inclusiveness.
Yeah.
But when you ask.
In terms of shared inclusive prosperity, how it's discussed in political science, the terms are it is, I mean, definitely it's an important one, right? The socioeconomic, but anyway, it's maybe for doing the break.
Socioeconomic is anyway, because you have prosperity, which is economic inclusive, and then I added, of course, the interstate dimension, not only between social strands in the same society, but also between member states. So I will think of that, but and then you said whether, yes, because you said solidarity is one of the three pillars, and you said why not add inclusiveness and fairness. To me, again, these three pillars include solidarity, but solidarity includes inclusiveness, and fairness is something that is being included both in the rule of law and democracy and solidarity. So it's something that is a horizontal value or a horizontal standard, let's say, maxim, that cuts both democracy, rule of law, and solidarity. So I can't have rule of law without fairness, I can't have democracy without fairness, I can't have solidarity. So I wouldn't add it to the three I mentioned, but I would rather see it as included in all of them. Now your second question was even more difficult because you asked us which mechanism could we adopt, but do you mean within the limited competences of today, or whether we should revise the treaties and then go beyond them?
No. I mean, it's just because I think that point of redistributive measures and you added also redistributive measures and solidarity mechanism. So sort of within our framework, so at droit constant, what could we do? But then it's beyond the drivers and obstacles, but it's most likely putting them together and say then what is our room for action.
Okay, this is more content oriented. Does not have to do with obstacles and drivers. Okay, and then I think the easier questions of Fabian and Stéphane. I think the answer here is common for both of you. Because social market economy, I think this is a fundamental principle of European economic constitutionalism, the soziale Marktwirtschaft. Okay, it comes from Germany, obviously. It has to do with this model of Rheinischer capitalism, Rhenish capitalism. So are we within this framework? I think yes, we still are, although this is a framework, which means that it leaves room for maneuver based on the outcome of the elections. And I think it's the same answer to the other question about reluctancy on harmonization. I think this has to do with what the political forces want to do. I mean, if we were after Amsterdam, for example, because we had a lot of socialist governments and social democratic governments in Europe, we had more a push towards more EU social policies, etc. But if you have right wing or even extra right wing, populist governments, etc., then of course you have. So that's why I understand that this social market, soziale Marktwirtschaft, is the framework that has to do with this model of Rhenish capitalism. And within this model, you can move, of course, to the right or to the left or to the center based on the outcome of the elections. And that's why it can be, it is eligible to be a constitutional maxim, let's say, okay, on European economic constitutionalism, because it leaves room for political forces to move to the one or the other direction, to the right, to the left, or to the center. That's how I understand it. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe the first, maybe I want to start with Fabian's question. Do we need a supranational industrial policy? And of course, the fundamental first question is, and yeah, how do you reach sufficient level of competitiveness, resulting eventually in prosperity, which may or may not be inclusive? And therefore, that's also a political question. So if you look indeed to the treaties, I would say quite a neoliberal vision of what competitiveness could be, making sure that the market works. Competition law makes sure that any artificial barriers created by companies don't rip up the market. So that's basically the argument. And also, for example, if you look at the Netherlands, until quite recently, the best industrial policy is no industrial policy. Actually, that was not completely true. It also depends on how you define industrial policy. Of course, we were always, to some extent, a little bit of, we had quite a favorable tax regime. If you want to take over Dutch companies, there are some national measures in place which sometimes make it quite hard to take over Dutch companies. So the question is whether it's really true. The US always said the best industrial policy is no industrial policy, but at the same time, they were heavily subsidizing research and development in the defense sector. DARPA, for example, which led to many inventions and many startups, which eventually reached some of the IT tech giants of today. They're sometimes a direct result of spending in the defense sector. And then, of course, there are more dirigist types of industrial policy. And if you look, for example, at the Draghi report, I would say it's somewhere in between. It's completing the internal single market, but it also talks about maybe creating European champions. If you look from an efficiency, there's been quite some research on European champions, and from an efficiency perspective, it rarely works. So from a competition perspective, you probably shouldn't do it. At the same time, if you have an even level playing field, where, for example, in the US there are certain giants, maybe efficiency shouldn't triumph. Maybe there are other considerations for which mean that maybe from a competition perspective, it's not the best idea to have European champions, but maybe from a sovereignty, from strategic autonomy perspective, you can make a different decision.
Yeah, but competition law basically results in no innovation and the product not coming in the first place, because I mean, no single one country will be able to come up with sixth generation
fighter or a fourth.
Yeah. So
yeah. So it's a I would say, so it's a, to some extent, it's a also a very important political question, which trade-off you make, I would say. Then, Christy, thank you for your insightful comments. I want to react to, at some point you said there is a tension between prosperity and security as a way to ensure compatibility. And I thought, well, yes, in the same way that you also, for example, see the twin transition strategy, where you combine sort of mutual reinforcing processes of digitization and sustainability. Of course, you could think of the same of spending in the defense sector and prosperity. In the US, it did work. I'm sure we can do the same if we change our rules of procurement. If we incorporate a buy European clause, it will definitely have an impact. But again, also depends, goes back to the question, what do you mean with industrial quality? What do you want it to be? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I think we started later and we had this break, so we might extend to 5 to 10 minutes, and then the other panel also has kind of adapt a bit. We will finally have 1 minute each to respond, and then I will start with Paul to the reverse order, then you know that already. And I was here, and then it brings me to you. Yes.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much to the three of you for excellent presentations. I have many questions, but I will limit myself to one, building upon the remarks of Stéphane to Federico about the issue of fragmentation. And so how to ensure sufficient coordination and synergies in defense spending. There, you said something interesting. You said that the NGU model might be an inspiration. And I'm not sure if I see how. I mean, the grants component and the idea of increased solidarity, yes, but NGU was also based on purely national projects, spending and reforms, and it was criticized for that it wasn't sufficiently cross-border and transnational. So there, I'd be interested to hear more, and essentially to ask you whether there is, let's say, a middle ground between, defense community going fully supranational and the current situation, which is going purely national. Do you see also something which also might be more politically acceptable to all actors? Thanks a lot.
Yes, and also for the next generation, you could say that there was no value added component. I have the impression, right? No positive spillover component there. If I see some of the projects, for instance, in Greece that I know they were selected, I would doubt. And also, if you go to the website, I went yesterday, it is the same thing. But I wanted to ask something to Pim and maybe to the others. Maybe Federico also has a view, and Lina as well. I was thinking how we've done industrial policy before, because I was thinking exactly about the national champions, right? Since the Alstom, what was it, Alstom Siemens, right? Saga. How have we done industrial policy in Europe to date, right? So I remember Sarkozy going in China and selling trains. I think the German chancellor has done that as well. And eventually I was thinking what could be the counterfactual, what would be better, right? What we have also tried to do, and either I participate or I have seen how it works, finance universities. All right. But the problem with universities is, although the great ideas are there is never critical mass, right? You have to bring them together to do something. And actually the Horizon Europe, as it is built, with of course no, let's say, accusation to how you've done it, is ticking boxes, right? Bring a university from Eastern Europe, bring a university from Southern Europe, bring maybe some interdisciplinarity, rather than really focusing on who are the best and bring them together. All right. So one solution could be indeed hubs, creating hubs, where you say, there will be some in Toulouse or some in Antipolis, would make sense. ETSI is there. Actually, you make a situation where you have the invention, you have a patent, and then you also standardize it globally, right? That could be indeed an idea. But really, I've been working on industrial policy for a long time. I think, for a long time, even before we got disillusioned with the trade regime, I was talking about industrial policy. But at the same time, I was hitting on a wall, right? Because I didn't know what exactly would be the right policy. And even, recently there was this work by Danny Roderick talking about industrial policy for services, which to me makes sense because I work on services. And I said, yes, it makes sense. But then yesterday, for instance, Jens, I believe, was talking about how important, and actually the Draghi report as well, by the way, how important industrial base is and all that, right? And there's even disagreement there. If you ask economists, they will talk about the manufacturing fallacy. They will tell you manufacturing doesn't bring employment, doesn't bring long-term prosperity. And eventually, if you create so much weapons, by the way, you have to use them somewhere as well. Right? And where exactly are you going to use them? So, I hope actually that Pim's work, because I believe he started this several years ago with his PhD, I hope actually that he comes with certain ideas as to how exactly to do it. Because I don't think that the US model is ideal either, right? So, I would think that there is a link between the current social inequality levels that we see, big inequality levels that we see in the US, and defense spending. This would be my hunch that somehow there is somehow something, right? That they cannot finance a safety net exactly because they spend so much money on defense, even if it is through bonds and not really taxation. Yeah.
And then last.
Thank you. The question for him, but also relevant for the others. Since Federico is bringing us back to the 1950s, I guess my question is, so when you think about we often think of the European Union as this institution that has neoliberalism in its DNA, right? But really, that was only firmly established in the 1980s. The internal market program and negative integration, etc. But let me remind you that that Jean Monnet was the national planning czar in France before he became the president of high authority of the European Coal and Steel Community. And so perhaps the European Union needs to go back to its dirigiste roots. And like the Coal and Steel Community, the European Defense Community, as it was designed, Euratom, and go back to the early years of the European Economic Community. What was one of their main functions was the governance of the agriculture. Of course, that's not industrial policy, but it involved very complex supply management. It's hardly a free market in agriculture. So the European Union in its roots was perhaps promoted or had an industrial policy, even if it didn't call it that. So perhaps the European Union today could be rediscovering those roots. It's kind of dirigiste, as a dirigiste policy.
Thank you. Okay. Yes, someone else? Now then, 1 minute each. Oh.
Yes. So the first question is very difficult. So how should we solve? Of course, the biggest issue with the EU is that, for example, for public procurement, basically, we have a complete open market, and you see that indeed, for example, for example, a Dutch national operator of buses tries to procure electric buses, then at some point there will be, you see that very often, there will be, for example, a French subcontractor, but there will be a Chinese subcontractor. You see that all the time, and it's very frustrating and definitely difficult to exclude that. So we're very open. I think we've been naive for maybe a little bit too long. Maybe a completely different angle. I think one of the main issues that we currently face in Europe is that that we don't have sufficient risk capital. I think that's one of the main. I think that's also something we discussed in Dublin at the start of this project. And I think there it was mentioned that maybe we are risk adverse. I'm not sure if that's really the case, or it's just a consequence of having no proper risk capital market. Of course, a big problem is that the capital market is very fragmented here.
Yeah.
So many fantastic ideas. There are many startups, also in the Netherlands, and once they're getting a little bit more mature, they move to the US.
Yeah.
That's what's happening. And many of the big tech companies, big tech in the US are full of Europeans. So that's for what I think there we can make a big difference. I'm not sure personally if I'm a big fan of a very de-resist kind of industrial policy. I think economic research has shown that the market fails very often, but governments fail even more often. So I'm not sure if they go to the right direction. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, although I didn't have a question in the second round, I will only say that Federico challenged the legal basis of Article 122 because it's about crisis. But of course, we have been living in a constant multi and poly crisis and everything. So we have always been saying that the European integration proceeds based on crisis and because of crisis. So this is the time that we either go ahead, and I'm with you in that spectrum, or maybe do not exist in the next decade or so. I think this is a political question, and of course, we all know what that means. That's about all the policies, not only social policy, inclusiveness, or industrial policy, but defense, security. That's it.
Yeah, just thanks a lot to everyone picking up on what you just said, Lina. I think the issue with the legal basis of 122 is that I think there is a democratic legitimacy problem, as you pointed out. And of course, it's a crisis legal basis, but when the extraordinary becomes the ordinary, and the European Parliament is always excluded from this, then I think we do have a constitutional issue that has to be very small one, but very small.
Yeah, but Federico, take the omnibus.
No.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, and then super quickly on NGU, Paul, absolutely good point. I think NGU is a model to me because it's common funding rather than just national debt. Then, of course, the spending is primarily national. I also agree with you, Panos. There is probably very limited added value in how the money is being used. There is this expression in the military world that says the generals are always fighting the last war. And I think definitely NGU is like the way we are fighting COVID, the way we should have fought the Euro crisis. And so I hope we will fight at least the next war by learning something from NGU. But then, and this is the second point I wanted to make, many of you have emphasized it, negative integration is easier than positive integration. I mean, negative integration, you remove obstacles, the court can do it, you apply competition rules. Positive integration requires you to pick winners and losers. It requires to say, yes, we are investing in this consortium to build the next aircraft of the future, or in that consortium to build the next tank. And of course, then you have the politics.
Yeah, and where we have redistributive mechanisms, because if you have winners and losers, you may restore some mechanisms to compensate the losers.
Of course.
And we have a truly unique market, common market with transfers across borders.
Now, of course, the US example, Panos, you mentioned that, but the way how they develop their defense policy is redistributive. Because Congress has an extraordinary power of saying the military bases goes in my district, the defense spending will be the factory in my state in Ohio, and so on and so forth. So actually, you can have a politics of redistribution around industrial policy. And I think, for us, the challenge is to start thinking about this. But I'll just end with the EDC treaty idea when on our optimistic forward-looking. We don't want to look crazy in this proposal, but I encourage you to take a look at this project. It's called thatcheetahproject.eu. And clearly, I think the legal point we're making is very sound. The Treaty on the European Defence Community, I think all of us, we all teach EU law. We go in the first class in front of students and we say, okay, the European integration started, the Jean Monnet, the Schuman Declaration written by the Jean Monnet, the coal and steel community. Then there was also a European Defence Community, 30 seconds, and then it's the Treaty of Rome and the internal market, right? So We don't dedicate any time to it because it's like history. From a legal point of view, it's very interesting that actually the treaty was signed and ratified by 4 out of 6. And there is nothing that prevents the other 2.
4 out of 6, 4 out of 27.
Well, 4 out of the 6.
No. I think only France didn't ratify it. Was it another one as well? Who it was? Italy as well. Big.
But Fabian, you're it's 6 states that could.
I know the technicality.
I think people a separate community, but the point I want to make is that the political circumstances of the 1950s are very similar to the political circumstances of today. What if we had suggested the idea of BBC 4 years ago? It would have been crazy. But the history is very clear. NATO became the organization defending Europe after the failure of this defense community, and when West Germany in 1955 was integrated, and the Treaty of Rome, the economic integration path, was a result of that failure. But now Russia is again a threat. The US is no longer a reliable ally. So I think we have to think seriously about those issues again.
Excellent papers, excellent.
And I'd like to announce that before you grab coffee, we stand outside and have a group picture, please.
Yes.
Whether you like it or not. And the coffee is on that side, but don't leave before the picture has been taken at all. I've been instructed by the lead.
Yes.
Don't
Yeah, that's what I was kept it known. That kept it known.
So we're doing a I also want to go back to a DDG approach.
Well done.
Well,
So I left time. My But you have stuff with. Okay, so it's good to hear my one. It's actually my first. I always assume maybe we've done so many stuff with him. I always assume like maybe Fabian has now we need one of this. It's a bit crazy, and I don't know, but yeah.
Thank you.
Knows how to get everybody going. Take a picture.
I could get that. I would. I have.
Yeah, look back.
But we here where were these levels?
Maybe one here, one inside.
Are you in the picture? He's later.
If the cameras is way to squeeze in.
You are only.
Panos is not here yet.
Panos needs to be perceived people.
We will wait for Panos. Just take it.
Because you're not toy.
They're not offending you, don't worry.
Are you sitting?
There's no comments.
Very good.
Thank you.
That's
Πάρε Λιδία. Νιώθω με 800 χρονών με τη Λιδία, δεν γίνεται αυτό το πράγμα.
Menelaos, we are a little bit, let's talk with Fabian, but actually we need.
Yeah. I have very quick comments, so I'll bring us back on time. Don't worry about that.
And I emailed you.
Yeah, of course.
Is there something to eat as well, or?
I think we have some little sweets. Afterwards, we have lunch.
Ah, we have lunch
Yes,
afterwards.
yes, I think so.
Here in the room?
Yes, here, it's upstairs, so it will be
Okay,
easy,
okay.
because I know everyone has
Okay.
things, has stuff.
Yes.
Who's gonna be first?
Είναι πολύ πολύ, αλλά νομίζω δεν ήταν σχετική με το topic σου.
Τις παρατηρήσεις σχέση με αυτό. Φάβια, να μιλήσουμε.
Prof, you are so sweet. Thank you so much.
By the way, we need to sell very cars to do this. That's the weird. Always one assumption. There's also when say So, what do you guys feel? Because if conversion, million consumers, right? It's asking drinks, these and other 50 million people. Yeah, it's Spain another 40. They say, okay,
EU and international economic on trade law, both the EU and. But the first thing also. I want to get there. Some people are saying this. People go off. And something. There. Is that only like? Hold on. But yeah, I understand. I have very different experiences in different panels. What happened? Exactly. That's the public security. But anyway, the critical.
Yeah, take it back. It's good, like, I was wondering if it's really beautiful.
Thank you.
Only for us.
Order. Yes. Ik heb zo weggewerkt in Koenderwijk.
Yeah.
I really want to. No, I was worried for you.
No, it's okay. Sorry.
I think the 1 decade that we're missing, maybe the 80s. Doesn't it say 80s? Males should behave like in the 1950s.
Well, I'm not too sure about that.
I'm gonna call my wife. I'm looking forward to dinner tonight, darling. What do you have in stock for me? This time, is the beer cold? No? Come on.
Ja. Throwing it out there again.
That's fine.
You know, shock the really back into existence. It's funny because we could have a whole afternoon on, okay, if we wanted to really do that, how we have to do construct this thing, we're gonna have that slides and many things to say, or anyway.
Speaking of so much. Yeah, even this morning on the way.
I was looking at my notes and said, oh, I forgot to, in the paper, this, the other, yeah. I vote. So they, are you? Oh, I'm worrying about the Olympics, so. Yes. He was one of these political scientists, economic studies was but it did not like most. So it's the same account of well, it's very different. So the book is so the empirical knowledge the document.
The slides will be put on the same page. No, it was
little sense of say another person happy, write this material version.
I know what it is. It can be confusion.
Hey, he said, I'm not supposed to get started. Yes. This is what. Considérablement, Jean Monnet Network. You know, this one.
Hey, welcome back again. So we have a very interesting third panel section with the speakers. On the EU internal market, we have Stéphane de la Rosa. Whereas on the external trade, we have Panos, Delimatsis from Tilburg. And on EU financial markets, we have Professor Dermine from Stellar. The format will be the same as before, so I'll first invite the speakers to give a presentation about 15 minutes. We'll have a little bit less time for discussion because we need to close the session at 12:45. Okay. So Stéphane, can I get the floor to you? Maybe you need some help with the slides.
1 second.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. One thanks for Federico and the Dublin team for and Rotterdam also, Fabian, for welcoming us here in Rotterdam. And we're very pleased to speak within this this network. So I've been asked to give some words about the articulation between internal market law and this issue of inclusive prosperity driver and obstacle. And when I prepared this presentation, I was asking myself that this concept of inclusive prosperity can receive many different meaning and different signification. And obviously there are overlaps with other concepts such as social market economy, model inequity, we have economic growth, the issue of public goods, the issue of how to assess wellness and economic indicator. And among all these approach, we can have overlaps and need a clear definition of what is really the meaning of inclusive prosperity. But from my side, and given this diversity of meaning, I wanted to focus more on the issue of inclusive within this notion of inclusive prosperity, and with a specific focus on the issue of services and activities that foster inclusion and that foster, I would say, social inclusion within a given society and social link between a given society. And regarding this approach, I wanted to have a reflection on how key concept or traditional concept of EU internal market law or EU economic law are designed or not well designed in order to foster inclusion in a wide sense, social inclusion and inclusion of people within a society. And to my point, or in my mind, I had the feeling that some key concepts of market paradigm in EU economic law are sometimes not fully well designed or should be reinterpreted in order to foster inclusion. So my presentation will be not really consistent in the meaning that I'm going to take 4 examples to address this issue, but 4 concrete examples. First example is this issue, which is very classical in EU economic law, of economic activity. This concept of economic activity. We all know, I think, a little bit the concept of economic activity in the meaning of the case law Hofner, where the Court of Justice in 1991 ruled that this concept of undertaking is really related to the concept of giving economic activity, and the economic activity is related to the fact of delivering goods or services against remuneration in a given market. And this wide concept of economic activity make a clear distinction in EU economic law between what is economic and what is not economic, and it's really a form of boundary in EU economic law. And in my opinion, and here I also take position in a paper I made in France for a think tank which is the Fondation Jean Jaurès, I also give the impression that we should maybe have a reflection about the case of the hypothesis where we shall not consider an activity as economic. And we know that we have two exceptions to the Hoffner definition. The first exception is the exception of public duties. The French expression is maybe more known, which is prérogative de puissance publique. When you did exercise typical power of public duty. We have a case law which is well known, which is SAT 1994, and we have a quite strict interpretation by the case law of this notion of prérogative de puissance publique, typical duties of public power. And asking myself in the current time whether we should not, or maybe we should give more margin to this notion of exception de puissance publique regarding issue of not only security, but also cohesion, issue also of environmental issue, new duties we can have to public power in a given society, in order to give a broader meaning to this exception de puissance publique, rather than the very strict exception we have at the very beginning of the case law. Other point which is still related to this concept of economic activity, this is the exception of purely social activity, activité purement sociale, purely social activity, and this is the other exception to the qualification of economic activity, which has been established more than 30 years ago in Petit and Pistre, and then it has been confirmed, but we still have a very strict interpretation of what is a purely social activity. We say Pistre, it can be sometimes applied to health activity, but only if it's non-profit, only if it's very well designed in terms of solidarity with pure redistribution, and we have few applications of this exception of purely social activity. We can have, for instance, for school with a private school, but always a very strict convention, as it has been ruled in a case, Congregation Escuelas Pías. But in the current context, I also wonder whether we should or not extend this exception of purely social activity, which could be supported by a wider interpretation of the principle of solidarity, which is very now in interpretation in Petit and Pistre. And I argue that also in the current time, this exception should be extended or at least readapted to the current tendency. So this is my first idea. We have this concept of economic activity. We have historically two exceptions to this exception. I argue that we should reopen the debate on the scope of these two exceptions, prérogative de puissance publique, purely social activity. In the same, other point, it's like more a picture I would like to deliver with you. Other key concept we have in EU economic law and internal market law is the concept of SGEI, the concept of public service obligation. Yet again, we have here a very important concept in EU economic law, which is central for inclusion society and inclusion people. And I argue also that this concept should be widened and should be more flexible in its interpretation. Example, we have this regulation on PSO, Public Service Obligation, Regulation 3070/2007, which is a cornerstone for public services in terms of transport, railroad, railway activity, and the main interpretation of the PSO regulation is to see that we can define or we can deliver a PSO when we have a given operator that could not be able to deliver a public service obligation if he was only considering its own commercial interest. And from this case law, it derived a very strict interpretation saying that we can have only a public service obligation if there is a real need, if there is not manifest error of assessment whether the market could or could not be able to deliver a public service obligation. And hence we have cases saying, oh yes, no, the market could be able to deliver a PSO. Oh no, the market could have been able to deliver a public service obligation. And yet, last year or 2 years ago, we had guidelines from the Commission on the regulation PSO, public service obligation, saying that the public authority has to select, I quote, the least harmful approach to the functioning of the internal market. The least harmful approach to the functioning of the internal market. Are we very sure that in the time of crisis, we need to assess PSO at the local level by saying whether it should be defined regarding what could be done by the market? For instance, we have here now cases for the Netherlands about train, saying that we should tender all railway system instead of maintaining the system of exclusivity of license, because the market could be able to be better. I'm not sure that's really the good way in the current situation. And I argue that also this key concept of PSO, which is really essential for inclusion of society, could be readapted, should be relaxed, and should lead member states to assess their own need, leaving abroad this concept of testing what the market could be done or could not be done for these very important services. Third example, it's about the public procurement now, or the key aspect of internal market. We do have the directive on public contracts, directive on the classical public contract, directive on concession 2014-23. In this directive, we have a very important principle of tendering public contract, and we do observe in this directive some few exceptions to recognize the possibility for a public contractor to organize themselves and to make in-house arrangements for their own needs. And on this ground, we have a very substantial body of case law on how to make in-house arrangement for contractual activity. But in the current stage of the case law, we do observe also a reluctance from the Court of Justice on making, I would say, special arrangement of public contract for, I would say, non-profit agreement, non-profit association, or association which are based on the principle of solidarity. Just an example, it's a case which has been ruled 10 years ago by the Court of Justice, Centros Pilar de Setúbal, where the court ruled that a contractual agreement between an hospital and acting as a contracting authority and voluntary organization which are based on the principle of solidarity, which are non-profits for transporting people to the hospital, this type of agreement should be tendered, unless the economic operator is non-profit, is based on the principle of solidarity, because there is this need of tendering. Again, do we really need to tender a public contract for health transportation, which can be done by Croix-Rouge or I don't know, because there is a need of tendering in the directive? I do not think that the way of interpreting economic law is going in the sense of inclusivity of people. And yet again, we have a key concept in economic law that could evolve and that has to take into consideration issue of solidarity in the way of interpreting EU economic law. And that point, for me, opens the point that we should maybe, we decide, we should open a new debate on all this issue of service of general economic interest, Article 106, and maybe using the legal base, which is still unused, which is Article 16 of the TEU, which is a possible legal base for SGEI. 20 years ago, we had a debate on SGEI, social services, and so on. It has been totally forgotten. We should reopen this debate, given the failure, given the big inequality we have in our European society. I argue also for that. Last example, yes, last example, where I want to challenge. I'm not arguing that we should keep away on this issue of competition and internal market. My position is just to say we have sometimes cases where there is too much importance on that, in order to be clear. Last example, where also I have this reasoning on the limit of market paradigm. Last example, which is the point, is about energy. We have this case in energy, which is the case anode, French case, Association des détaillants d'énergie, anode, case de grande chambre, where we had an issue about whether a member state can or cannot maintain regulated tariff in the field of gas or electricity, and whether should regulated tariff for electricity or gas should be maintained, how they should not be maintained for fixing the price of energy. And what did rule the Court of Justice? I'm quoting the ruling. The Court of Justice ruled that the price of supply of natural gas must be fixed exclusively by the play of supply and demand. By the play and supply and demand for achieving internal market, and saying again that a public measure of intervention inside price is a measure which is by itself an obstacle to the achievement. So a public measure that say, okay, let's fix or let's adapt on prices, in itself, par nature, would be a restriction, sorry, not entrave to the freedom. Yet again, I really wonder whether this type of legal reasoning is well equipped or well adapted to the current challenge. Let's see the crisis we have in energy, in electricity or gas. Can we still say in a ruling that the price of gas or electricity are only done by the play of supply and demand? It's not, it seems to me, totally far from the reality, from the geopolitical reality, and also from the reality of the functioning of the energy market, whether in gas or electricity. And yet again, the judge and the doctrine should be, in my opinion, propose a new way of interpreting the articulation between the market and energy. So I'm not here to make a revolution or to change the thing, but I just say that, in my opinion, we have some key concepts in EU economic law that are relevant. I'm not arguing that we should keep away or change everything, but in order to focus on more inclusive activity, in order to take into consideration many time of failure in the functioning of markets, whether for public service, whether for energy, whether for hospital, we should adapt our legal reasoning by fixing boundaries between what is inside the market and what should be done by public intervention. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Very much. Rosa, next we continue with Professor Delimatsis. Again, 50 minutes on the external side.
I can do it myself. Very nice. Have you sent the presentation?
Yesterday, yes.
Yeah, okay, it's not fine. So we have it. Punch it off. Oh, that's what Tilburg looks like. What is it? That's what Tilburg looks like.
Yes, the beautiful part. We also have uglier parts. But
Panos.
Federico, you've seen the Greek influence, or the Italian influence, for that matter. You could say the Mediterranean. You know, we need to do some maintenance. So I'm Panos Delimatsis, professor of EU International Trade Law at Tilburg University. Thank you very much, Fabian, for the kind invite, and also the organizers, Federico, and all those involved in PROSPER. I'm very glad to be a part of this, and I enthusiastically accepted the invitation so much that I was this optimistic, let's say, plan to finalize a paper. Currently, it's something that looks like a paper, and Menelaos had to bear with that, so I thank him also for his patience with that. So we'll be talking about EU trade policy and inclusive prosperity. Yesterday, Jens was a bit, Martin, I'm sorry, was a bit disappointing to me because he didn't come with a definition, right? So I was expecting to use some of his, but I'll come to this and I'll try to be as helpful as possible for the project. So the EU trade policy is in constant transformation, has been in constant transformation for several years. The key moment, if you like, was of course the first Trump administration. So we came with a trade policy which was no longer focusing so much on, let's say, trade for all, but rather focusing also on effectiveness, assertiveness, and alternative actually means of trading, with the US being increasingly isolationist. So in 2021, when Biden was back, right? I think, yes, Biden was back. We finally did the latest update actually on the trade policy. So after the end of the Trump administration, thinking that Trump will not come back anymore, but we still need to remain, let's say, assertive or be more assertive, become assertive actually, I would say, and also more actively export our values. And of course, you know, the events, let's say, of the last year or so, or this year or so, that actually we haven't been prepared for the second Trump administration, although we created some very, very important instruments, and I discussed them a bit in the paper, including the anti-coercion regulation, including the foreign subsidies regulation, and several other instruments. So the questions that I thought would be interesting for us is, first, whether ensuring inclusive prosperity is an objective for the EU external action in trade matters. And I would argue that it is not. It is not. If we see, and yesterday I was trying to look a bit at the treaties, if we see the term prosperity, and we search for the term prosperity and try to find it for what policies in the external action are relevant, the only policy that I found, but Fabiana and the others can correct me if I'm wrong, is in the neighborhood policy. So when we deal with, let's say, the eastern neighborhood or the southern neighborhood, sad story, the latter, and I can expand maybe more in the discussion. You know, prosperity is mentioned, but other than that, it is not relevant. Article 21 of the Treaty on European Union, which is the important, let's say, guide, yardstick for EU trade policy, doesn't refer to prosperity either. It refers to eradication of poverty. So it is relevant. I think Lina would agree with me. But and only, of course, vis-a-vis developing countries. But otherwise, we focus a lot on democracy, human rights, and exporting fundamental freedoms. This is it. And then the question, of course, for our timely discussion, we're discussing about economic security in the previous panel, is whether we can square inclusive prosperity in external action, right? Whether we can ask indeed that we are adding inclusive prosperity in our policy, and then also we still strive for economic security. So whether these two can go together. And for that, I will need to reflect further, and any feedback would be, welcome as well. So if we go to the economic security strategy, by the way, the DigiTrade changed its name recently, and it became DigiTrade and Economic Security. It was not before the case, but now it is maybe a sign of the times. The economic security strategy focuses on these three P's: promote, protect, and partner. And for our purposes, of course, the last point is relevant: the partner. So create alliances to foster sustainable value chains. Finalize FTAs, the Mercosur saga, of course, the agreement with India, which I remember I wrote a paper about when I was still a PhD candidate, right? 20 years
You're still
ago.
young, you're still young.
20 years ago, Federico. Huh? I mean, we're still discussing this. And we hope now, because Trump put a 50% tariff on India, that actually India will turn to us. It may happen. It may happen. And of course, the use of the global gateway strategy, which is the investment vehicle, the global investment vehicle of the European Union. Let's put it briefly, right? So essentially, couple agreements that we do and incentivizing, let's say, partners to do work on climate, for instance, right, in line with our Green Deal and the net zero strategy. In order to do that, we also finance them, right? And we hit two birds with one stone in that sense, because we not only achieve our objectives or export our objectives
to our partners. But then we also somehow managed to create security in our supply chains, right? The way that we want our supply chains to work, which means sustainably. Okay. So the Draghi report does refer to trade a bit, right? And he says this is a quote. So we'll need a genuine EU foreign economic policy to retain our freedom, a so-called statecraft. So he has a particular vision of trade policy, right? The trade policy is there to serve the foreign economic policy. And this is, again, new. Trade policy in the EU has always been politicized, of course, but for the first time, we're talking about this, strategic way about the trade policy, this economic statecraft. So what we need to do, according to Draghi, is coordinate preferential trade agreements and direct investment with resource-rich nations, right? Because we are energy dependent. And this is what we do. Chile, with China, we haven't yet, but with Chile and with Indonesia, by the way, as well. Right, we try actually to get to extract some resources from them, and of course pay the price for that. Then build up stockpiles in selected critical areas. I think this is also quite astonishing. And then create industrial partnerships to secure the supply chain of key technologies. We're not alone, of course, in this economic statecraft idea, right? This is a slide that I nicely stole from Boston Consulting Group. A reliable source, I would assume. And, this is very small, of course, but you see that everybody, the idea is that everybody actually has put, let's say, in action some type of economic statecraft, right? So there is a war of attrition there where everybody tries to essentially, hit each other. And there's also certain fragmentation. Of course, the WTO is in such decline that there is no coordinating forum of what's going on there. EU trade agreements, what I want you to keep from that slide is that actually our biggest trading partners, or we don't have agreements with our biggest trading partners. And this is the US and China.
We now have.
Well, this is our trade agreements, they call it a trade deal, we call it humiliation. And definitely the WTO inconsistent. So we violate Article 21, by the way. But otherwise, we have been very active. We haven't been active with Africa, astonishingly, right? If you remember, the first von der Leyen Commission was a geopolitical commission with a clear focus on Africa. Nothing happened there, not in North Africa. After Arab Spring, there was a lot of ambition, and we increasingly became disillusioned, and for the other countries as well, right? And clearly, this is important because China, in the meantime, took our position there. What are some important considerations? This is a busy slide, I know, but what I would like you to keep from here is what I said earlier about Article 21. Right, that actually whatever values or objectives we have in Article 21 are objectives which the court will not interpret strictly, in my view, right? Because there is a broad margin of appreciation. We've seen that in several cases by the European Court of Justice, more recently Singapore opinion, and even the sustainable development, let's say, objectives that we have, because they are relevant for inclusive prosperity. They will not be held against, let's say, the European Union. If, for example, the European Union in one treaty, in one FTA, free trade agreement with New Zealand, for instance, has enforceable sustainability provisions, while in the case of Mercosur, obviously, much bigger, bloc, you do not manage, let's say, to bring enforceability in this, let's say, agreements. Okay, I need to go put here. All right. Oh, I'm going to put everything there. So when it comes to the paper, I discussed digital governance. My plan is to discuss digital governance, sustainable development, and supply chains and economic security. Currently, I think the digital governance part is the most developed. What is very interesting is that we have adopted a program on digital diplomacy, and we are actively pursuing, right? Essentially, the most active players there that I see is Singapore and the European Union, right? So much actually that it starts becoming a bit overlapping initiatives, right? So we have the digital trade chapters in FTAs, we have digital partnerships, we have digital dialogues, and we have technology and trade councils, right? And often all these with one single country, right? For example, Korea, Japan, and also digital trade principles agreement. So there is a certain sequencing and clarification that has to be made there as to what exactly all these agreements are planning to do. And my argument is that what they plan to do is obviously export, yes, see, GDPR, Cybersecurity, AI Act, and Digital Services Act. So essentially, can I? No, I cannot. So essentially, it is the third bullet point, right? So essentially, export our values and the way we think about regulating digital services to our partners, right? Creating a certain network where everybody would agree that, for example, data sharing, privacy, data protection, no data localization obligations would be accepted, let's say, by everybody. And our focus is clearly on Asia, right? So with Asian countries, we have done this type of work. And I think there indeed, there is, let's say, a powerful consensus that is slowly building. And other than that, what we also have been very, very active is ensuring that we will work with these countries in terms of regulatory cooperation, particularly standardization. Right, the EU has this urge to maintain its leadership on standardization. We have done it for several years. In the last 5 to 10 years, China has managed actually to gain a lot of ground, and we want actually to challenge that. And we have the leverage, until now at least, to do that. And we have also the capacity to do that, interestingly, both the institutional and the intellectual capacity, I think, to do it until, at least now. In terms of sustainable, I will skip it. I wanted to say something about, other than just to say here that we have this variation, as I said earlier, with respect to enforceability, right? We have labor rights, and this is relevant for Lina, who can discuss it also in the discussion later during the Q&A. I don't have too much time. I just want you to keep this idea that there is variation depending on the bargaining power of the other party, whether there is enforceability or not, right? For some of them, if, for example, they step out of the Paris Agreement, this is an essential elements clause. This means actually that the EU can withdraw from the agreement. For others, and there is also a suspension of consensus possibility, so sanctions, while for others it is not the case, simply because they are too strong commercially. I think there is an elephant in the room. I don't discuss it in the paper, sorry, Menelaos, but there is an elephant in the room, which is mobility, right? And we clearly have a problem in the European Union when it comes to internal market mobility and, relative to the human capital that we need in order to sustain, let's say, our industrial base, right? So Draghi is all about industrial base, but who's going to work? Who's going to produce all these products that he is talking about? Drivers for prosperity. So here, the EU has both an economic and a social purpose, right? And this is important. And we try to, let's say, have this mirroring or parallelism between what we do internally and what we do externally, right? We don't need to be totally consistent. The court has never also demanded that, but we try, right? And this is important. Something actually that can drive prosperity on the ground is this relatively new institution of domestic advisory groups, right? So in all these agreements, we ask our partners to create stakeholders groups, right? And our feeling is that somehow our stakeholders group will talk to them and have interlocutors in order to advance social issues, right? So prosperity issues. And that's a very interesting element. I know just obstacles, just to say last, so when it comes to obstacles, and Fabian can take a picture of that as well, and then we can discuss it later. I think here there is this idea of a zero-sum understanding of the world economy, and I think this is here to stay. The second relates, of course, that we are totally resource dependent. All right, we have an extractive superpower on one side and a dependency superpower on the other side, and we're somewhere in the middle. There's this famous paper from EUI that came this year that exactly describes the situation for the European Union. We don't know which direction to go. For now, what we do is extraterritoriality, deforestation regulation, the cross-border adjustment, regulation, where we charge, let's say, the other trading partners. But this is something actually that we postponed, right? We don't dare apply this type of regulations because we have a lot of, let's say, reactions, negative reactions. They call us green protectionists and also imperialists or neo-colonialists. So this is something actually that will not end up well as I see it. However, there are, let's say, there are opportunities where there are obstacles. There are also opportunities, for example, for the European Union. Now, the European Union is the biggest, let's say, humanitarian aid provider because of the USAID construction. So this is something that where the European Union could do a lot. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. Thank you.
We'll move on to the next topic on EMU and financial market. Professor Lina, please.
Thanks a lot. Well, first thing first, I'd like to thank Madame Team Fabian Menelaos team for the organization of this event, and of course the DCU team, Federico, Jean, Charlie, for the excellent coordination of the project thus far. So for this panel, Fabian asked me to speak about the Economic and Monetary Union, which happens to be one of my areas of expertise. I see plenty of EMU experts in the room, people that Fabian might have turned to. It was here to come to me, and here I am. So trying to offer.
I had to throw somebody in front
yes,
of the line.
exactly. So here I am trying to essentially offer some transversal reflections on how EMU as a policy can contribute to inclusive prosperity and essentially the question that I'd like to explore in the next 15 minutes is the following. Where does EMU sit in the system of objectives? Where does prosperity, sit in the system of objectives, in the teleological or purposive architecture of EMU? To what extent can EMU support, but also to what extent does it inhibit prosperity-oriented policies? Now, as a first preliminary consideration, I understand that you discussed this a lot yesterday. How should we approach prosperity? How should we define it? I also understood that you did not find any final answer, but my premise here is a very general and I believe fairly consensual definition of prosperity as an overall state of economic, social, and environmental well-being that ensures every private and public actor the opportunity to thrive. So that is essentially the starting point that I take to develop my arguments. And essentially, these arguments will revolve around three main points that I'd like to make. The first one is the following. What I'd like to show you is that, in my opinion, EMU is first and foremost a stability-oriented policy framework. That means that prosperity is not entirely absent, but prosperity is only touched upon in an indirect and tangential manner. So prosperity is not what EMU was, at least in the origin, primarily about. It's not the objective that it first and foremost seeks to pursue. Secondly, what I would also like to argue is that we find in the EMU framework a number of flexibilities, a number of breathing spaces, which enable to complement the overarching stability goal with additional complementary policy objectives, some of which can contribute to inclusive prosperity. Some of these spaces have been there since the beginning. Others have been developed later on, but what we see is certainly an ever-increasing political willingness to mobilize these flexibility spaces. But nonetheless, and that is the third point that I'd like to make, these additional and supplementary goals retain a second order status, which limits the magnitude of the changes which can be pursued and which prevents a fundamental reorientation of the EMU around the objective of prosperity. And this is made all the more difficult that the EMU framework is a highly rigid framework marked by a lot of constitutional provisions which are hard to obey. So firstly, and maybe going back to the, let's say, intellectual and philosophical origins of the EMU was a policy deeply influenced by order liberal thinking. And according to the order liberal school, the economy should not be left entirely unregulated. We should not go for absolute laissez-faire, but politics and law should essentially provide for a framework which enables the economy to thrive and to develop. Law and politics are primarily there to create the conditions of stability. At the microeconomic level, that implies regulating the behavior of economic operators with rules such as conventional law. At the macro level, this implies creating the conditions of macroeconomic stability to ensure the economy to thrive and to develop. And EMU was very much designed as a community of stability. And the Maastricht Treaty has primarily been designed to create these conditions of stability. And this meta-objective of stability informs every prong, every pillar of the EMU construct. And here I'm just stating the obvious, of course, but if you take the monetary pillar, the objective of monetary stability, the objective of price stability, we all know that, is deeply embedded into the constitutional fabric of the EMU. The ECB was given a narrow mandate strictly focused on price stability, leaving other considerations such as growth or full employment in a secondary status. This narrow mandate was paired with strong independence and a fairly deep insulation from politics. The Euro crisis did not fundamentally change that. We observed an extension of the ECB's stability mandate from price stability to wider financial stability, but nonetheless, this deep stability orientation remains there even after the Euro crisis. The stability orientation is also very clear in the economic pillar, which was very much designed around the objective of macroeconomic and fiscal stability. In the treaties, this is in a way translated by the concept of soundness, sound public finances, sound economic policies. The overall objective here being the reduction, if not the erasure of macroeconomic risks, which might affect the common currency as a public good. This has, of course, several manifestations in treaties. An idea of fiscal responsibility that member states should not free ride and should assume the consequences of their fiscal choices, fiscal disciplines with, of course, the excessive deficit procedures and the fiscal rules enshrined in the Stability and Growth Pact. And lastly, a system of coordination and surveillance geared towards the reduction of economic divergences. And again, the Euro crisis and the many reforms which were adopted in its aftermath very much confirmed this stability orientation. And lastly, this objective of stability is also at the basis of the latest edition of the EMU framework, what one might call the third pillar, namely the banking union, whether it is the SSM, whether it is the SRM, whether it is the single rule book, all of these components, all of these policy initiatives are very much geared towards an objective of stability and financial stability. So the consequence for prosperity is that prosperity is not absent from the picture, because according to the order liberal assumption, stability should support economic development, it should support growth, and ultimately it should support an economy that serves society and generates prosperity. But prosperity is in a way only touched upon in an indirect and in a tangential manner. It only has a second order status subjected to the grander meta-objective of stability, which complicates the proactive pursuit of prosperity-oriented policies. The second point that I'd like to make is that what we noticed is the development of what I call flexibility spaces in the EMU frame, which constitute potential basis for the pursuit of a prosperity agenda. So we observe that EMU contains a number of these spaces which enable essentially to complement the overarching stability objective with additional policy goals which might be conducive, which might participate to inclusive prosperity. Some of these have been there since the beginning, others have been developed later on, but there is clearly an increased political willingness to seize these opportunities in these spaces and to exploit them in practice. On the one hand, because there is a political realization of the unsatisfactory nature of the framework, and on the other hand, because there's also been a progressive realization of how powerful EMU might be as a vector of societal change and as a vector of potential prosperity. So these flexibility spaces are probably most evident in the economic pillar. And there, what we see is clearly a diversification of the objectives and a diversification of the tools which have been mobilized under the economic pillar, and the development of a number of initiatives under the economic pillar, which definitely participates to the prosperity agenda. One example is the willingness which has been shown by the EU institutions to rebalance the economic and the social under the EU. This is something which was initiated by the Juncker Commission with the European Pillar of Social Rights, which led to many different things, a redynamized legislative agenda, an attempt to socialize the European semester. This is something that has been continued during the pandemic with a number of initiatives which had a clearer social meaning, an attempt to impose milder and more consensual forms of conditionality under SURE, under NGU. So this is, in my view, a good example of such a flexibilization. We've also seen that the EU has, under the economic pillar, sought to promote future oriented investments, transformative reforms, very clear with NGU and its many offsprings. So the development of an embryo of fiscal capacity structured around a new understanding of solidarity, a much more redistributive approach of economic policy, so really participating to this prosperity agenda. This search for flexibility is also quite clear under the monetary pillar. And there we see also an increasing willingness to mobilize the ECB, so-called secondary mandate. As you will know, under Article 127, the ECB is also mandated to support the general economic policies of the European Union and to contribute to the general objective of Article 3TEU. And there's been calls in the policy sphere, in the academic sphere, to make more ambitious use of that secondary mandate. This is very clear in the area of greening, attempts being made to green the ECB monetary policy by integrating climate risks in the policy-making process, by eventually adjusting the bank's bond purchasing and bond holding programs. This is something that we can also see with regards to equality, calls being made for the ECB to take into account the redistributive dimensions of the processes make and to better infuse equality considerations in its policies. So that's something that's quite clear as well under the monetary pillar. And lastly, this is also something that is clearly noticeable under the banking union, with there as well calls being made to better integrate side considerations in the mandate and the mission of the various institutions involved. But, and that is the last point that I'd like to make, these adjacent, these complementary objectives nonetheless retain only a secondary status under the EMU fabric, and that inevitably inhibits the scope of the changes which can be contemplated. It also makes these choices very contested and very contentious, leading to tensions within the institutional system. If you take the example of the secondary mandate of the ECB, this has led to a number of tensions and a number of discussions, the discussions about the compatibility of the pursuit of side objectives with the primary objective of price stability, questions about the compatibility of such initiatives with the principle of market neutrality, and considerations about whether this fits within the independence framework and the limited democratic legitimacy of the. Similarly, if you take the example of the Stability and Growth Pact, we've seen that after a certain number of years of flexibility and of pro-public investment policies, well, the tide has turned in 2024 with a reform of the Stability and Growth Pact and a certain tightening of the overall policy stance on these matters. And lastly, these limits are furthermore exacerbated by the fact that the EMU and its overall stability orientation remains a rigid legal and constitutional framework. It's a heavily constitutionalized framework. Some might say an over-constitutionalized framework, which is very difficult to amend, and which overall makes a more fundamental rearticulation of EMU around prosperity all the more difficult. So three ideas that I've tried to convey here, and with which I wanted to kickstart the conversation. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Can you extend it 10 minutes so we have some more?
I will only need 5, but thank you very much, and many congratulations to all speakers for 3 very rich presentations. I can personally already see the makings of 3 respective policy papers, or maybe even journal articles for the purposes of PROSPER. Without further ado, I will provide my comments to save some time for discussion. I will actually start in the reverse order, if I may. So starting with Paul. Paul, you did note, and I wanted to touch on this first because it was the very last point on the rigidity of the framework, which I think is a really interesting point for all our discussions, really, and not just for economic and monetary union. However, I do wonder how rigid it is in light of the flexibility spaces that you correctly identified in the presentation, the various objectives that we find in the treaties, and also the possibility that we have to work within those treaty objectives. So, for example, the example that you gave about the ECB, I thought was really instructive. The fact that within the primary mandate, really, we have fit all those things, and before we even go to the secondary mandate, in terms of greening the European Central Bank's operations and the like, as well as, of course, the latest initiatives related to rearm, where we also see some more flexibility spaces, admittedly. Related to that point, you did mention that the EMU is a stability-oriented framework, and I of course agree with that. And I was wondering, and I was really glad it was on the final slide as well, what do you make of the references to inclusive growth, for example, in the revised Stability and Growth Pact? Do they retain a second-order status, as you put it? Because I found it a very interesting case of, drafting the new fiscal rules, the fact that, we try to tick all boxes, as it were, and also mention all these things and how they affect, perhaps, our understanding of these rules now. Last, do you perhaps a bit more provocatively, since there was a lot of discussion about financial stability and is inclusive prosperity required for financial stability? We can ponder on that a little bit later. I'll give you some time by asking questions to the rest of the participants. For Panos, obviously I'm much less of an expert on the subject matter of this paper, but nevertheless, we all know that on those topics we know the least, we come up with the most questions and we have the most doubts. So I find very interesting that how you know that EU trade policy may have an impact on prosperity, both out with and within the EU. And you notice tension between what the EU intends to do trade-wise and the changing geopolitical environment. And I would like to ask you, to what extent have economic security concerns taken over here? And is there a tension with achieving prosperity? Or is open strategic autonomy, which you also mentioned in your paper, a crucial precondition for prosperity? You did cover also in your presentation, both in the presentation and the paper, FTAs and digital trade agreements. And I wanted to ask, because I know very little about this, are the EU standard setting efforts through digital trade agreements, the DTAs that you discuss, key for our prosperity? And why, do these need to be distinct from or separate from FTAs? That was a point that I'm much less knowledgeable on. Also, drawing on the various interesting examples that you mentioned with regards to our agreements with various countries, is there a first assessment of the more recent trade and sustainable development chapters and their enforcement? And I'm speaking, I have in mind here the examples that you mentioned with New Zealand, Thailand, Kenya here. Have any disputes arisen, or is it only the one that you mentioned under the EU South Korea FTA? And have any sanctions been applied for violation of core labor climate commitments, which you also discussed in your presentation? Our topic is inclusive prosperity, so I'm obligated to also ask the following question. When can FTAs be an obstacle to inclusive prosperity in Europe and beyond, if I may say so? Is it about the structural trends that they do not touch upon, as you discuss in your paper? Is it about their effective enforcement or the lack thereof? Or, somewhat provocatively again, is it the very existence of FTAs in some cases that can be an obstacle to inclusive prosperity? Also, if you have any preliminary assessment for the EU's efforts regarding the global gateway strategy, it would be most welcome. What do you have? I think it's something very significant that we discuss very little outside the trade law and policy. So any thoughts on this would be most welcome. Last but definitely not least, I come to Stéphane. Thank you also for your excellent presentation. First of all, I think we can all agree that contrary to what was mentioned in a previous conference that some of us were in the previous days, there is still a need to teach internal market law. I think that comes out very forcefully from your presentation. In your presentation, you stress the need to adjust legal reasoning to better recognize limits to market paradigm and favor public intervention. And you drew on a lot of examples or things that the court has said in its case law. But do I read you correctly in saying that it does not only fall on the court to adjust its legal reasoning, but it is also the job of, depending on the area concerned, the Commission and the EU's political institutions? And in addition to that, we discuss a lot procurement, and I want to take the opportunity to ask you also in light of our discussions today, how you view, if you have any comments on the changes that were made with regards to defense procurement, so Directive 2009/81 in the context of REAM Europe. Is a coherent picture emerging here, or are these piecemeal changes problematic in any sense? And last but definitely not least, again, I mean, a provocative question for everyone, can an internal market for defense products truly emerge or not based on these changes? Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Before we invite responses from the panelists, let me first open up the floor for questions. Okay, I will go in reverse order. Left, please.
Thank you. I have a quick question for Stéphane. The social economy, which is like charities and cooperatives, etc. This is something that the Commission in previous von der Leyen Commission had said that they wanted to promote the social economy. They actually had an action plan for the social economy. This is part of the economy that work for people agenda. And if you look at the actual action plan for the social economy, it's all soft law tools, right? So it's not about actually changing the legal framework of the internal market. So if they were serious about promoting the social economy, which sounds like very close to what you're talking about, should they be looking at the kinds of initiatives that you have discussed? Christy?
Yes, thanks very much. Thanks to all the presentations. I have a question and a comment to Paul. So the first question is about the approaches. So, I mean, your research question is very clearly outlining the fact that it's a teleological and purposive reading. But my question would be, would you come to a different conclusion if you would have a law in context or functional approach where you look at some spillover effects? So for instance, I mean, the literature is saying that banking union at the end of the day is not really an accident of history. It's not only triggered by the crisis, but you would have deep roots over history that sort of laid the foundation for that project to become a sort of a real one. And you know, political economy analysis saying, you know, if you want to have financial integration, financial stability, then you need to have a supranationalization of financial policies. So with this functional reading and another approach to so the integration that is represented with EMU, somehow some spillover effects over the subfields within EMU, where you may read prosperity within it. So sort of really departing from only the objectives and the teleological interpretation we may have from the EMU construction as such. Perhaps a very difficult question, but that was just to throw in another approach that may lead to different results. And then if I may comment on the banking union framework and perhaps have another reading beyond the financial stability objective. I mean, somehow Menelaos alluded to that with the, you know, do you have prosperity within financial stability as an objective? Here, I would perhaps sort of emphasize other objectives that are part of the framework and that are as important as the macro objective of financial stability, namely micro objectives, where the safety and soundness of banks within the banking supervision policy area is as important as financial stability. And there, if we expand a little bit on that, you know, thinking about the last crisis where, you know, it was a little bit simplified, but somehow at some point the policymakers were saying, this time the banking sector is part of the solution and not really causing the problems. And somehow they were helping in the recovery. We may need to unpack a little bit what it was exactly, but the economic and social recovery sort of relied also on our banking sector being healthy, being stable, having went through all those requirements for safety and soundness. So coming back to the question of micro objectives, somehow if we unpack them, perhaps there is an element of prosperity. And linked to that, reading also the banking union framework in terms of the objectives, if we look at the resolution part and, you know, the fact that we want to avoid bailout and avoid resource to taxpayers' money, to some extent, perhaps we're reaching an inclusive prosperity objective because we no longer have the citizens, the government, and the sovereign paying the bill. So again, there is always the intent and the reality of it. We know that the resolution framework to some extent has failed us in terms of what was intended to be. But if we look at your starting definition of prosperity, I mean, to me, as a citizen, definitely, you know, in terms of we have a better prosperity, sort of the risks are shared within the banking sector itself, and we are not sort of asked to contribute there. So to some extent, it could be part of the prosperity objective. That's it.
Thank you. On the right, Marcus.
I also have questions for Paul, I'm afraid. The European Pillar of Social Rights, I mean, are there any implications, legal implications of these rights? I mean, they're probably not enforceable, but would the court take this into account? So I could assign this question to a lawyer. And the second thing is we have the macroeconomic imbalance procedure. And then I think under the Spanish and Belgian presidency, there was also talk about a social imbalance procedure. Something like this has been put in place. even though with a different name, I think it's one of those social convergence indicators. Is that in any way significant? Jan, you have a question?
Yeah, I don't really want to add to the burden of Paul. By the way, I thought all three of you did a wonderful job in trying to work with what we put to you. So I'm really impressed by that, and I think that is that gives me a lot of food for thought for Prosper also and for future endeavors. Paul, is it, you know, reframing it in terms of solidarity as a frame for EMU's impact on prosperity, or dealing, and is it then dealing kind of like with economic disparities between member states, or would it make sense to, and is it the same to frame it in terms of the redistribution effects of EMU? And there, of course, we had a lot of discussion in the context of the M of EMU, the redistribution effects of monetary policy, where it has been claimed that the unconventional monetary policy had many redistributional effects that maybe currently that should not have been there, whereas probably macroeconomists would argue monetary policy by definition has redistributional effects. And which is fine. You can say when they relate to the primary objective, that is also within the parameters of why this technocratic agency has been established and been made independent. But of course, if once you start to expand that to other objectives, whether it is what's the phrasing of the ECB, assisting in the transition to net zero or something like this on the webpage. They have this, well, I already think like, well, that's actually quite proactive anyway. Or even what does monetary policy can do against economic inequality? I mean, that's maybe even further out there. Of course, the question is that of the legitimacy, and I don't mean so much in terms of accountability, but in terms of the central bank independence. There's a certain political economy rationale to that. Yeah, why you remove that from politics. But I mean, people like Paul Tucker, who have argued in the past, you know, redistributional policies must be in the hands of elected politicians, and not unelected unelected technocratic agencies. And actually the fact that politicians may applaud that they are with technocratic agencies should make us all very suspicious, because this is about maybe also potentially shifting blame and basically political impotence to take the necessary decisions that should be taken. I stop my rant here.
Thank you, Fabian. I think we have time for a closing round of responses from the panelists. Stéphane, I think it's up to respond.
Yes, I'm going to synthesize on the question. Fabian asked me to have a reflection on obstacle and driver on internal market. So I didn't want to focus on specific branch of internal market, to put on services or goods or what you want. But my purpose was to give you a very reflection, which is very open, about are we really sure that currently the boundary between what is economic and not economic in the current case about state aid, about PSO, about public procurement, about energy is well designed and well addressed to take up the current issue and to take into consideration the shift that we can observe for now 3 or 4 years of a growing public intervention in the economy and in the public sphere, with all this stuff about strategic autonomy. And my position is not really, and it should evolve, in my opinion. It should evolve both about the very concept of economic activity and the expansion you can observe, and also about the relationship between social sphere and public procurement, and what I I explained in my presentation. Yes, we have many initiatives, the social pillar, social initiative, promotion, social NGO, and so on. But still, we have this vision following which any social activity, whether you have a little part of economy, is an undertaking. You will still have to take into consideration these big boundaries, these big limits, in order to make a real push. And the difficulty, in my opinion, was you observe institutional position, for instance, guidelines, position of the Commission. They are, in my opinion, a little bit weak, saying that they follow the case law. It's just a codification of the case law. You see guidelines about public service obligation or social services. It's just a codification of case law. Sometimes it's a codification of very old case law, to say peace and so on. And we don't have any new idea about, maybe we take a little bit distance about, to say peace 30 or 40 years ago, or Hofner 40 years ago. And I think the role of doctrine or the role of agenda at the Commission is to put new idea in the table, whether about the agent, les agents, when they have to plead at the European Court, or either in the guidelines, my opinion. And about public procurement, yes, we shall foster preferences, local tendering, and so on. But yet, again, in public procurement, we still have these limits that we can observe for the sort of economic activity. And for public procurement, the limit would be the core principle of public procurement, principe fondamental de la commande publique. The core public principle of public procurement, which has been led in the case Austria, equality, non-discrimination, transparency. And yet again, if we really want to make involve the system, we will need an evolution of the interpretation of that concept, meaning that the concept of equality, non-discrimination, transparency, as they have been recognized in Austria in 2000, they are not well designed in order to foster preference, local tendering, and so on. So yet again, we need also to make evolve this core concept.
Thank you. Panos,
How much time do we have? 5 minutes. We both have 5 minutes. Each. Okay, good. So thanks, Menelaos, for the comments. All very pertinent. So you have to send me, because I think I missed some. You have to send me because so you have it written. So first, maybe I'll start for the end, and you will tell me if we have time to discuss another one that I missed. So there is this global gateway impact assessment, right? So as I see it, the global gateway, but maybe I need to read more, replaces the development policy of the EU and this policy coherence for development. And there, several issues, including migration, trade, security, etc., were bundled, and now they are separated, right? So we have a different, let's say, approach. And also there may be an overlap between the GSP, so generalized system of preferences, and the global gateway. From what I understand, or my current understanding is that these two are linked. I don't think we have an impact assessment yet because we haven't. The first phase hasn't finished, right? What I've seen in the website is that they have different projects in various, I would say, countries. And there are also some, you could argue, inclusive prosperity projects, right? For instance, relating to gender equality, female empowerment, SMEs, right? Which brings me to your second point about the FTAs, whether they are an obstacle or not. If you go to NAFTA, for instance, the North American Free Trade Agreement, there have been studies suggesting that actually the impact in certain areas in America, in the US, has been so important that justifies why we see so much of the Midwest turning to vote for Trump. Right? They are so much disenchanted by trade. And there is work by Melitz and others, Andras from Harvard, showing exactly that somehow indeed trade was good, but it led, in the region at least, it led to consolidation of companies, which meant actually that certain companies were bought by others, right? And other companies simply ceased to exist and fired people, right? So in that case, you could argue, oh, yes, this is an FTA example that is an obstacle, was, acted as an obstacle to inclusive prosperity. How to address that? What the EU, for instance, does with its, let's say, well, there are varying policies there. Don't discuss the paper. I don't know if there is room for that, right? If you go to the DCFTAs, if you go to agreements with Ukraine, with the neighborhood agreements, the ENP agreements, as we call them, there you would typically address this through regular approximation, which is exporting the internal market to them, right? Particularly in specific areas like telecom, financial, etc., etc. And then through that, indirectly, maybe boost their growth so that they can have money to redistribute. But I mean, the idea remains that there is this redistribution that happens at the national level, and it should be done by them. Having said this, for example, if you take the EU South Korea TSD chapter, the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter, Korea was a country which was very much against ILO conventions relating to labor rights. And by the way, the TSD chapters of the EU became the vehicle to push other countries to abide by ILO conventions, right? A few years ago, when we were talking about sustainable development, it was all about the environment. All right, now workers' rights, right to association, for instance, was the dispute EU South Korea, right? Because there was no right to unionize in Korea, and the EU brought this under the Trade and Sustainable chapter and won. Is it, this brings me to your other question, is it effective? No, Korea hasn't implemented the report. Was it obliged to implement it? No, because the agreement says that there have to happen consultations once there is the panel recommendation. It's not a panel recommendation, it's a panel of experts recommendation. So it is excluded from the general dispute settlement chapter, which would give the right to the EU to impose sanctions. Right? And I think we are there. Other disputes, yes, there have been other disputes. There has been one with Indonesia on TSD, but at the WTO level, where we lost was about biodiesel, palm oil, and the EU lost there. And it lost so badly that it decided to appeal to the void, right? Because the appellate body doesn't exist. The EU said either Indonesia will join the interim mechanism that we have that replaced the appellate body, or we believe actually that this is a wrong decision. Does it matter? Yes, because the EU maintained its countervailing duties because it thinks that palm oil and other, let's say, raw materials that are used to biodiesel and palm oil, they are subsidized. So we impose a tariff of, I think, between 15 and 30%. Right. So it does make a difference, let's say, on that side, but somehow, it's a bit of the Venus approach, right? The EU is the Venus, right? As we say, and let's say the Mars approach there as well, because obviously you heard the developing country economy. I'll stop here, and then we can discuss the open digital autonomy part.
Oh yeah,
thanks a lot, Menelaos, for your excellent comments. Thanks a lot for the questions. I try to answer most of them, and we keep the rest for the lunch. Very quickly, Marcus, on your question on the European Pillar of Social Rights. Are these rights? No. So this is from a legal perspective, this is a soft law instrument. This is a political declaration. How has the court used it? At the time, the hope might have been that the court would have made a similar use of the pillar as what it did of the charter when it was still not yet primary law. At least that's what a lot of experts hoped the court would do. But the last time I checked, the court did not really use the pillar, and you don't have many occurrences of the pillar and of the court in it to, rule on social rights cases. But that doesn't mean that the instrument has been useless. I mean, it has played a key role in redynamizing the political agenda and in triggering various kinds of initiatives, some of which I've evoked in my intervention. Menelaos, on your question of the rigidity. So what I've tried to argue is that the framework is rigid. It's not excessively rigid in the sense that it enables flexibility, but its rigidity and its constitutional nature prevents fundamental rearticulation of the prosperity, and also it also implies that changes and sometimes structural changes always occur a bit in a hidden way, and also sometimes in an undemocratic way. This relates to what Federico discussed about 122. This relates also to what Fabian touched upon about the expansion of the mandate and the inclusion of redistributive choices into the mandate of a technical body. And so this implies in the end a lot of institutional hypocrisy, in the sense that, I mean, we do fiscal redistribution without doing it. We do industrial policy without saying it. We do defense policy without saying it. And so this is problematic from a wider, perspective, from the perspective of the citizen. The citizen does not fully grasp what's going on. And then lastly on the question, and is in a way relates to what Christy said and what you said as well, the relationship between financial stability and prosperity. I mean, the task that Fabian gave us, I mean, I found was a difficult task, because on the one hand, prosperity is a very multifaceted concept, brings in a lot of different things. It's all the more complicated in the context of the EMU, which is by essence a very complex and multidimensional quality. And the thought I've presented certainly a bit stereotypical and a bit simplified. So there's certainly much more into it that I should look into. And indeed, what you touched upon about the relationship between financial stability and prosperity is certainly right. And where I need to make a lot more work is on the banking union, because that's probably the pillar in which I'm the least comfortable. It's the most, it's the less proximate to me, but there's certainly much more into it that I will further in the future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of the third panel. Thank you to the panelists.
Yeah, and this brings us to brings us to my 45 minute speech.
Summarize.
Rant on
start with trade.
How none of the speakers want anything that we wanted them to. Now, the opposite is true. I think I can also say this on behalf of Federico, that we are pleased with the discussions we had. Federico is of course pleased also with his own discussion, and I'm with my discussants. No, but seriously, I think this is exactly the kind of discussions and debates that we want. On the one hand, we are struggling with the contents, right? And well, actually, the institutions are struggling with them, or they are not, but they don't realize that they are actually struggling because they don't conceptualize it at all. It's kind of like, as I said yesterday, you weren't around. On Eurolex, I found 50 regulations that are in force that have the word prosperity in them. 50. But it means nothing, because unless so that's the one side, and the other side then really, well, okay, but what does this then mean on the ground when you go into these policy areas, right? And what is going on? So thank you very much to all the speakers, discussants, and the chairs, and a very special thanks that goes to IPEC. Without making note, we would not have done this. So this is for you on behalf of the European Union. The organization committee. Thank you so much, IPEC.
So thank you, Rector.
And finally, and I know this is a little bit on the spot, but Stéphane, basically we're kind of like virtually giving the floor to Paris, and maybe just a couple of words on the next event in the series would be much appreciated.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
We will be happy to welcome you, just checking the precise. When the. 28th of November, in Paris. So, the event will be, on the 27th in our Université Paris Créteil, for the first session. And the second day, it will be in Paris, at Cité Universitaire Internationale, which is in the south part of Paris. About the program, we have decided, and I get an impression of that, to focus on the Clean Industrial Act. So the proposal that has been on the table last February, and taking into consideration this proposal, we have designed a program that taken the different branches of this general strategy, whether about tax, regulation of energy, state aid, and many other issues. So the master ceremony is more my colleague, Laure, for all organizing administrative point and so on. I'm just more behind about the scientific proposal. So all the panel now are very done. We have the program, so it will be sent maybe Monday or next week. Okay. And in the program, we have a mix between academics and practitioners. And we have invited practitioners from the European Commission, both in the field of energy, tax law, and state aid law. Voilà.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stéphane. So that concludes this event. For those that do like food, there is it's not a free lunch because you have to work for it. I think it's
On the second floor.
on the second floor. Thank you very much, and I hopefully see you upstairs in a minute. Thank you.
And thank you to Fabian. Before we do it.
Yeah, and if you can,
First week in October.
take your cups, lavender, fresh, outside.